over 50%, so really 55% of the global economy, global GDP, is moderately or heavily reliant on nature.
Welcome to the Business for Good podcast, where we spotlight people making money by solving some of the world's most pressing problems. I'm your host, Paul Shapiro, author of a nationally best-selling book on food sustainability and CEO of a company in the same space. On this show, I speak with founders, investors, and thought leaders who prove that doing good and doing well can go hand in hand. The biggest challenges facing humanity are solvable and are often profitable too. My hope is that this podcast informs, inspires, and maybe even helps propel you to build a business that makes the world a better place. I'm glad you're here. Welcome, friend, to episode 188 of the Business for Good podcast. All right, we have gotten a lot of positive feedback on our last episode with Sarah Noshkova, the CEO who's raised millions of dollars to create AI that warns wild animals how to avoid dangers like airplanes and trains. Her work, which is designed to make money by sparing wildlife, is directly related to the topic of this episode as well. So here's your wild fact of this episode. In 1970, there were about 3.7 billion humans alive. Fast forward half a century to today, and we've more than doubled our population to over 8 billion. In that time, the world has lost about 70% of its wild animal populations, not just species, populations. Humans and the animals who we raise for food now make up 96% of all of the mammalian biomass on Earth. Wild mammals like elephants and whales and lions make up only 4%. It has been quite profitable to deforest the planet so that we can feed all of these animals who we farm so we can eat them. But part of the cost has been tremendous biodiversity loss. Well, what if it were actually profitable, not just to destroy biodiversity, but to actually protect it? In other words, could biodiversity protection be a venture scale opportunity? Climate tech has already attracted hundreds of billions in venture capital. AI is on fire. Fintech or financial tech won't slow down. But biodiversity? Forests, soil, microbes, invasive species, birds, safe glass, are these really investable categories? This episode's guest, Tom Quigley, says yes. He is the co-founder of Superorganism, one of the first venture funds focused entirely on biodiversity protection. They just closed a $26 million fund to back startups that aim to slow or reverse species loss. But here's the question that we really dig into. Can protecting nature really generate venture-style returns? Over half of global GDP depends directly or indirectly on nature. As ecosystems degrade, supply chains destabilize, insurance risks rise, commodity prices spike, and entire industries face exposure they barely even understand. If biodiversity loss is a systemic economic risk, then companies that reduce that risk might not just be ethical, some of them may be inevitable. So what does biodiversity VC actually want to see in a pitch? Tom gets into what he is seeking, including areas where he doesn't necessarily see a technological fix. We discuss whether animal-free proteins are part of his thesis. Is bird-friendly glass investable? Can AI that protects wind farms change the game for offshore wind? And where does behavior change fit into all of this venture-style return anyway? If you're building something in food or materials or climate or AI or supply chains or deep tech, this conversation is definitely for you. I'll let Tom tell you the rest of the story. Tom, welcome to the Business for Good podcast.
Hey, thanks so much. I'm really excited to get into it.
I am really excited to be talking with you as well. Now, I am familiar with Conservation X Labs because I am personally a donor to the organization for which you used to work. I'm extremely interested in hearing about your transition from the nonprofit world to becoming a venture capitalist. It's not a well-worn path that many make. But before we do, where did you come from? Tell us about Conservation X Labs. What do you guys do?
Yeah, sure. So the conversation goes further back than that even. I was a ski instructor in high school and then went to college and became a climbing instructor and then graduated college and became a dive master. I shouldn't say dive instructor for people ready to fact check me in the background. But it just presumes that people know what the difference between a dive master and a dive instructor is. I would have presumed a master was a higher level. Is that not true? Which is the great part about that name, right? I could say that I'm a dive master and people assume that I'm like Lord of the Ocean, but actually a dive master is a slightly lower working title than a dive instructor. So
maybe I'll be a podcast master. That sounds like a good title for me.
It is giving anything like that, and it's all one word as well. So it really does give Poseidon vibes. Through that time, I was doing a lot of learning and trying to, sense make and find my way through the field and becoming a lot more interested in ecosystem services and environmental economics and really the value argument for nature and what business can and could do to be able to, have good effect for biodiversity and for global conservation. I had an opportunity to join a startup as employee number 2, a very early stage media startup called Real Vision, and that seemed like a really great way to earn some business chops. And so I took that opportunity and I plunged headfirst into a startup world. And so for 3 years there, I worked alongside the founders, helping scale that company. We did very well for an early stage startup that didn't really know what we were doing at that time, and we did over $1 million of revenue in our first year of operation, pretty much from opening the doors. And people really loved what we were building. And most importantly for me, I got bit by the tech bug, and it just seemed there was so much in there that was very, very interesting. After coming out of that experience, I had this sort of one lobe of my brain that was very startup focused and one lobe of my brain that was, always ever going to be doing conservation work. And I found this great organization called Conservation X Labs, which was really at that time and still today, one of the few organizations that you would go through if you were looking to blend those two disciplines. But working at Conservation X Labs really helped me think about the drivers of biodiversity loss at the higher level and thinking about how does overexploitation, land use change, pollution, invasive species, climate change, the 5 primary drivers of biodiversity loss, how do those all how do they work as pressures to both directly and indirectly drive nature loss and species extinction? And so it was through that I got a really deep steeping in the industries and the problems that drive biodiversity loss across a lot of different geographies and across a lot of different types, from tropical rainforest deforestation to invasive species to behavior change practices, and through a lot of different technology types as well to provide solutions. So my co-founder Kevin Webb comes from a long venture capital background. He had been at that point in venture for almost a decade. He himself had made, some many great investments in the venture world, and many, as happens, you just see a lot of things play out, and had done quite well, but had always been nature obsessed, and was currently at Columbia doing a master's and focusing in on all of the different topic areas that he thought would be most relevant for focusing on a venture thesis for nature and biodiversity. And so he and I met in 2019. We started talking about what it might look like to angel invest, directly invest into some of these startups. What would outcomes look like? What would a portfolio look like? I started connecting him to some of the companies that we were working with more, and he had, just got to see firsthand how supportive he was, and a really terrific partner to a lot of these founders that we're building. And so in 2021, we started talking more seriously, angel investing together, and thinking about what it might look like if we were to take a full portfolio approach to biodiversity loss. And then finally, we couldn't find enough reasons to not try anymore. And so we went out and started shaping the fund and raising for the fund. We did our first close in the beginning of 2023. And fast forward to today, we've now just closed our first fund, $25.9 million, Fund 1, with a lot of really terrific LP backers that we're extremely excited to work with. A lot of really great companies and founders that we, love working with every day. And we are putting that money to work to add another 15 or so companies to the portfolio over the next year and a half. And that's where the world is today. And we couldn't be more excited.
Cool. So you mentioned you have these LPs. You've raised about $26 million to close this first fund. First, congratulations. Now, my question for you is this. Do these LPs, how many of them are motivated by an altruistic desire to prevent biodiversity loss, which is, of course, your driving motivation, right? This is what you've devoted your life to. It just so happens that venture capital is the manifestation of that right now for you. But you are, I would presume, more of a missionary than a mercenary in this respect. What about your LPs? Are they thinking, yeah, this is I'm going to get above market returns if I invest in startups that are combating biodiversity loss? Or do they think, hey, I think that I trust my money with these guys, and I also really am motivated by the mission?
Yeah, I would say that on the missionary-mercenary spectrum, we are probably even closer to mercenary than I think most people expect when they speak with us. I think that comes across as well when we speak with LPs, is that some of our messaging is kind of first and foremost, the business has got to work. The venture returns have to come through. Like, this is a fund. We are returning you your money and several stacks on top of it. Like, that's very much the messaging, and it's very much our focus. And so, we equally weight whether we think that this business is going to work from a venture lens and whether it will have global impacts on biodiversity at the sort of speed and scale that we need it to.
So, Tom, let me ask you, if you are more close to the mercenary side, what's the thesis? What is the argument that startups focused on preventing biodiversity are going to generate above average market returns?
So there's a lot of, when we started talking to people about biodiversity, very much the reaction that we got was like, do you mean forest carbon? Do you mean ecotourism? Like, what are you talking about? And the way that we approach it is like this. If you think of us, let's start with climate tech. If you think about climate tech and say, okay, we're in this Overton window where some people do see that you can make venture capital returns off of the climate opportunity, as long as you are working with large existing industries, solving very, strong pain points for them, aka creating value, probably using new technology or approaches that make it worthwhile for them to be buying and putting their budget lines towards this, while also sort of incidentally and accidentally solving for climate change, the existential crisis. If you can do those three things, then you can have a good venture-looking business and drive returns off of that. For us, you kind of just swap the lens of climate change out for biodiversity loss. And what that means is you see a lot of different stuff. The drivers of biodiversity loss are different than the drivers of climate change. Like I said before, the 5 drivers: invasive species, overexploitation, land use change, pollution, and climate. You see a whole different suite of stuff that means you're not investing in DAC, you're not investing in grid resilience necessarily, you're not investing in batteries necessarily. And all of those things mean that you get to see things around like invasive species that would just not really be on thesis for other people before. But because it is purely for us, we get to look at those companies and we get to make those types of investments where it makes sense from a venture lens. So there's a couple of, like I said, it has to pass both tests for us. It has to look really good from a venture perspective and really good from a biodiversity perspective for us to make that investment. And there are several sort of macro drivers around what we think is driving better business through some of these biodiversity companies. And also, they all look different. We're a generalist fund. We focus on the things that have those impacts to biodiversity. So our impact thesis around each one of these companies is going to be different. We have several thesis areas that are our core 3 pillars that we think, we're going to find businesses in here that do both those 2, venture looking and global impacts piece. They'll live in the middle of that Venn diagram. But all of these companies are going to look different too.
So you've made a strong case that biodiversity investing is different from climate investing, right? You mentioned DAC, which to the uninitiated is direct air capture, like doing carbon dioxide capture directly from the air, right? And why invasive species prevention may not be attractive to climate investors and direct air capture is not of interest to biodiversity necessarily investors. But what is the case for not just that it's different from climate investing, but that it's going to generate above market returns? Like, why would somebody who doesn't care about biodiversity per se, who's an LP, and you're pitching them to say, hey, please, consider our fund, what's the argument that biodiversity is going to, biodiversity accentuation is going to perform better than just putting it in an index fund or in any other general VC fund or a tech fund or anything else?
There's a couple of things that are sort of underlying that are often surprising. So one is that there's far more risk exposure from the global economy to biodiversity loss than really was previously thought even 5 years ago. So there was a seminal study that was done pretty recently in sort of the early 2020s that found that over 50%, so really 55% of the global economy, global GDP, is moderately or heavily reliant on nature. And there's some that you would expect, like timber and fisheries. And there's some that you wouldn't expect. They're getting indirect benefits from healthy biodiversity being fully intact through really the ecosystem services that those things are providing. And so as that fabric erodes, and it is eroding in the last, since 1970, we have had a decline of 73% of wildlife populations. So a really tremendous decline of biodiversity in our lifetime. Over a quarter of species are at risk of extinction, again, within our lifetime. Those individual species losses and population losses result in a fraying of the general fabric that knits around the work that we do as humans and economies and industries that we build. And so you can think of it like a risk multiplier. As you lose biodiversity, that all of a sudden stuff starts going wrong more frequently. The things that started, that used to happen continually, like pollination services on your farms, water provision services from forests nearby, and watershed support, storm surge and storm prevention from the mangroves on the coast. So all of those things start suddenly to go away. And for businesses that we have, now started to, we are entering this era of awareness where those large corporations are starting to understand that, there are really high impacts to my business as usual from the degradation of biodiversity. And I think this is another key piece, that you can get very cheap, very popular, and very effective risk reduction and impact reduction by improving nature and biodiversity in your and around your supply chains. And so both of those two drivers of the risk reduction and benefits gain, I think that those are really key core components of why we see a lot of corporations that are starting to push towards all of these different technology or restoration efforts, that they're starting to put more money into their supply chains to make sure that they are resilient over time. We've seen things like the cocoa crash in a few years back, where the price went absolutely through the roof. Those were climate and biodiversity related problems, and that had a very concrete, real impact on not just people's lives on the ground, but industries. And so we're seeing an increase in interest. We're seeing an increase in investment into solutions. And we're seeing large corporations put together individual innovation hubs that are working to step some of these startups up through their large supply chains so that they can have different options, in 2, 3, 4, 5 years time. All of that is coming into the conversation around why biodiversity. Some of this also, I would say, is there are things that we see as benefiting biodiversity or conservation that other people may not even think about. So it's probably worth voicing over 3 thesis areas that are sort of strategic areas that we think that we're going to find both returns and biodiversity impact. The first is looking within the industries that have driven biodiversity loss historically, the ones that, through those 5 drivers, have really led to a lot of the harm. Where are we able to invest in some of those areas that can either disrupt those industries or accelerate the transition away from those harmful practices? That, because those markets are very, very large already, leads to scale and speed very quickly, as long as you're also driving a lot of value through them. So that's one. The second is the overlap of climate and biodiversity. We're not the ones that are going to be focusing on electric vehicles or a lot of the stuff that the climate industry has focused on, but we are going to focus on the stuff that overlaps nature very heavily. So areas like soils, oceans, wildfires, things like the net zero transition, and where we're able to do that without too many harms to nature. All of those things are opportunities for us to catch tailwinds from the climate and the climate movement, while also putting wins on both scoreboards. And the third area is enabling technologies, where we are really focusing on a pure deep tech thesis. We're looking at any types of companies, from AI to genetics to robotics, that have their own industry arcs, but focusing in on the things that we know through our work with conservationists would create whole new capability sets for them. And so being able to really look at, know what they need, see the deep tech landscape, and pick out the ones that we feel from the earliest stage have incredible growth arcs and also would add, a whole new arrow in the quiver for conservationists doing the work. So through those 3 areas, there's a lot of industry drive to start using these tools, but every one of the, as a generalist fund, every one of those individual companies is going to have a different industry, a different market that they need to play through. We need to get over the line to believe that that market needs it, wants it, that there's excitement and traction, and And then that at scale, there will be impacts to nature.
So you have referenced a couple of times now the leading drivers of biodiversity loss, and I want to get into that. So if you look at the Center for Biodiversity, a nonprofit organization, I was looking at their website, and their assertion is that meat production is by far the leading driver of biodiversity loss, and this is why they are such advocates for creating animal-free meats, either plant-based or cultivated meat, and so on. Vox recently had a story about biodiversity loss and where forests are disappearing. And I'm going to quote from the World Wildlife Fund on Vox. It says, "It's not toilet paper or hardwood floors or even palm oil, it's beef. Clearing trees for cattle is the leading driver of deforestation by a long shot. It causes more than double the deforestation that's linked to soy, palm oil, and wood products all combined." So it seems like, the nonprofit organizations, so their Center for Biological Diversity or World Wildlife Fund, are saying meat is the biggest problem. It's not comparable to the other reasons why we're experiencing biodiversity loss. What are you guys looking for in companies that can help wean humanity away from animals as a food source and toward more sustainable solutions for protein?
Yeah, you're very right that cattle is one of the, if not the leading driver of particularly tropical biodiversity loss. I mean, if you're starting to look at things in like oceans, then it depends on the geography. It depends on the type of cattle. But the 100%, this is one of the most important drivers because it contributes for several reasons. One is because it contributes to a number of those individual drivers beyond just the one, right? So there are several vectors through which cattle is very harmful to biodiversity. One of those vectors in particular is clearing of tropical rainforest for pasture, which can, is wholesale wipeout of individual species and populations that live in those areas. But also things like runoff, also things like methane production towards climate, there's numerous. We could go on. If you were going to try to look at cattle, then you need to have a thesis around what cattle, what type of beef, where. Are you looking at things like dairy? Are you looking at things like leather? These are things that are byproduct of the beef industry and will, sometimes like 10 to 20% of the cost on a cow comes from some of those byproduct. So there is no, in my opinion, silver bullet. I think that there's a lot of behavioral change that is needed as well. I think that when we're looking at solutions, it's a little too easy to get focused on an individual solution type rather than the complex of different solutions which are needed and which matter in different geographies. So, for example, solutions that are most focused on the tropical rainforest deforestation piece need to be focused on farmers. They need to be focused in areas like Brazil and South America, where there are, individual livelihoods very much wrapped up in the cattle and the herds that they are running there. It needs to be focused on alternatives and economic stability for those people and being able to think about how do we prevent new loss of land? How do we restore degraded land? How do we also provide good alternatives that also provide dignity and consistency and benefit for the people that are doing that work? All of those have to matter. So, I'm not necessarily like a tech silver bullet guy. I really, I come from a conservation background and I've seen a lot of some of those poorest areas in the world.
So let me ask you, Tom, if we were, let's say I was sitting here not talking to Tom Quigley from Superorganism. Let's say I was talking to somebody who was running a climate fund and I said, hey, fossil fuels are a huge driver of climate change. What are you looking for to help replace fossil fuels? And that investor replied to me and said, well, you have to think about the type of coal, where the coal is being produced, what's going to happen to the coal miners. Would they say that, or would they just say, well, actually, I think geothermal is going to help get us off of coal and oil? Or would they say, I think nuclear or wind or solar or whatever they're into? My question for you is, what do you think are the primary ways that we can reduce the number of animals used for food? I realize that you're concerned for the farmers who would no longer be raising animals, but in terms of companies that you might back to help solve this problem, what are ideas that you think are investable right now that could help say, okay, well, we're going to raise fewer cattle because we have to raise fewer animals, right? Like there isn't a way to get around it. Yes, it will involve behavioral change, but every time that we have displaced animals in the economy, it's been behavior change, whether horses transition to bicycles and cars, or carrier pigeons to telegraphs, or whale oil to kerosene and eventually electricity, or using goose quill pens eventually to metal fountain pens. Like there have been a lot of displacements of animals in the economy that resulted in people losing their jobs, but transition to new technologies. Are there new types of technologies that you think could help displace the use of animals for food?
Definitely. I mean, and I recognize that it can be unsatisfying to talk to a tech investor and hear that, actually maybe the number one thing that we could be doing is probably not tech. And I think that is important, though. I think it's really important to start there because it is far too often and particularly prevalent with VC, I think, to start, having hammer nail mentality where it's like, oh, I know, we'll just throw this tech solution at it, right? Because what we have is a hammer, but there are an awful lot of different types of nails out there. And this, it's important to do really good solution and problem fitting. And I don't necessarily know that there are super strong, like that there is one tech to rule them all that is an equivalent to saying like, oh, okay, like we just need to move off of coal and we need to move all fully to hydrothermal and we need to yada, yada. Now, the problem is demand, right? The problem is that we have such strong beef demand, and that is what is really driving all of the, the increase in consumption, the high price, that needs to change. I think that is largely a cultural and behavior change thing. I don't know that is necessarily a VC thing that I need to be going to do to play in. It needs, I think that there are a couple of terrific organizations out there that are really focused on behavior change. If you look at something like WildAid has done terrific work in changing behaviors around direct exploitation of endangered species and the use of things like shark fin soup as a cultural, movement. That is terrific work. Doesn't really have like the pure play tech VC investing side. Another great organization that I like to cite a lot on the behavior change side is RARE. RARE is a conservation organization that focuses entirely on behavior change in some of those areas in the tropics where you really are focused on making sure that they're taking a lot of lessons from public health efforts and global development efforts that have happened over the last 20, 30, 40 years. How do we do effective behavior change efforts to be able to reduce some of those drivers? So I recognize that's an unsatisfying answer, but I do believe that tech really plays a role in some of this. And so there are a couple of companies that I could point to as good examples here. I think Working Trees is a really nice example of where you can start moving some of these degraded pastures and working with cattle farmers to finance and support the move to silvopasture, where now you are starting to provide another alternative marketing income type for that same land. You're also going to trees on the land, which is, a strong portion of what they plant are native and biodiverse plantings that can never be taken down. And you get more yield out of the cows through silvopasture approaches because of less heat stress that you're getting from those shaded cows. So that is one type. I mean, there's other types like moving entirely, like a group like a Pontera that is moving to fully restoring and switching from being cattle farmers to being restoring, land protectors. And we are, they're fully planting native plantings and biodiverse sort of rainforest types in those areas. I think that those are really good approaches in those specific areas. So again, geography, culture, all of that matters. They are all using technology quite a lot to be able to support that. I mean, there's a lot of GIS work. There's a lot of software building to be able to manage those plantings, to track those plantings. The MRV is associated with all of those. Those are the types of things that we might invest in. Those are the types of sort of force multipliers for the work that needs to be done. It is important to take that view. And I don't, necessarily think that we need to just kind of have a one size fits all approach, because I don't think that that's what's needed.
Yeah. Okay. That's interesting. I do think the idea of helping cattle farmers shift to reforesting their land and not raising cattle, but reforesting is a great idea. It's good for that land. As you pointed out, though, earlier, it is very difficult without reducing demand for beef because somebody else is going to grow cattle somewhere else as long as the beef demand remains the same. And there's, of course, a huge crop of companies from Impossible Foods on down who think that they can create the beef experience for people without cows. And so whether they'll succeed or not is another question altogether, right? So far, none of them have. But in the same way that you have a whole host of clean energy startups saying we're going to replace, instead of saying reduce demand for energy, they're saying demand for energy is going to keep on going up, but we're going to help satiate that demand for energy without fossil fuels. And I think the people, like if you were to talk to those from the Impossible Foods type of companies, they would say, yeah, beef demand isn't going to go down. That's why we have to create beef without cows, whether it's from plants or animals or fungi or fermentation or whatever it is. Now, I know that you've already addressed this. I don't want to harp on it. I do want to also point out on the shark fin soup side, I do have an idea, which is, plant-based meat as a category right now is very unpopular with investors for the most part, largely because there haven't been any big winners in this space for many years. But still, fintech is very popular with some group of investors. And so I wonder, maybe somebody should create like a plant-based or cultivated shark fin soup and call it fintech. And then they're going to get,
oh, look at this.
then they get the attraction. They start attracting the fintech investors. So that is my idea. So people can do that if you want. I'm not going to do it. So.
It is really worth continuing though to I love the fintech idea, and I'm by the way, if you have a pun name on your startup that you're pitching me, you're already gonna get like one foot in the door. We're very heavy on the
one fin in the door.
One fin in the door. Yeah, exactly. We're very heavy on the wordplay in Superorganism, but it is worth continuing to stay on how things like this can be effective. And there have been several approaches that have looked like that and seemed very glossy. Like, for example, in the rhino horn, there was an approach to do 3D printed carrot and rhino horn that's identical to the same and flood the market. And it's a kind of an economic experiment, and it didn't really go anywhere. And there were, reasons for that, including some legal challenges on that from different activist groups that disagreed with the approach. But you look at something like Wild Aid's work in mainland China, they're 2006, they did a campaign with Yao Ming, When the Buying Stops, the Killing Can Too, and really pushed awareness across this in China. And it led to an 80% drop in consumption in shark fin soup since 2011, right? 80% decline in sales, complete price collapse, 50 to 70% price collapse as the prestige of the dish evaporated. So, there are extremely good high leverage solutions that don't necessarily look like tech solutions, but still can have an extremely strong effect. Now, will that same type of thing work for beef and cattle? I think that the American consumer, particularly, which is the driver, like the largest driver, and Europe to an extent, but you would know better than me here. I don't want to get out above my skis, but how do you really affect the American consumer and their behavior change? Like, I don't know that we're going to get an 80% drop in beef from a similar thing, but you look at something like, how you tackle these thorny problems. Microplastics, and Netflix just put out this documentary about how microplastics are affecting male fertility. And, holy cow, is that, I think, going to drive a pretty big movement around people making sure that trying to remove plastics and other things from their lives. So these are super pernicious. We need to have both tech and innovation and investing at the edge of that, which we are, and also these really unique and innovative approaches as well.
Yeah, I just want to comment on the rhino horn aspect because I was very familiar with this. So this company, Ambient, was trying to create rhino horn in a lab and then flood the market, or they scale and flood the market to crush the price of rhino horn, and they didn't take off. And in my own view, with all respect to the founder and the people who worked there, I don't think that it was like so-called activist groups opposing their projects. I think they couldn't raise capital because it was a difficult thing to raise capital for, and their boogeyman was activist groups that were giving them a hard time. But lots of startups have all types of problems with advocacy organizations from time to time, and they make it through. So that didn't work. But it's an interesting idea. It's a pretty interesting idea for sure.
Very fair note. And, I think we need to be able to take more shots on goal. Like there's, we think about the one thing that I think that is important is when we think about impact, it's important to us that we are not thinking about like a J curve of impact, right? We want linear or exponential impact, but we don't want impact to drop negative in approach to impact growing to positive, where you would see the kind of like the classic venture fund J curve of like, returns are going to go down and then they're going to go up as then things exit. But, we don't want to be causing more harm on the way to causing good. We ideally don't want to be causing deep harms in one area and solving solving some goods in another. So all of that is important for us to kind of roll up in this wax ball as we're considering each individual opportunity.
Well, Tom, you've given a perfect segue to my next topic here, because we're talking about solving one problem, but creating another one elsewhere. You guys are invested in AI detection for birds at windmills, right? And so windmills are obviously trying to solve one problem, which is, getting us off of fossil fuels by switching to wind energy. But they kill a lot of birds. It's just the truth. A lot of these kill a lot of birds. So I'd love first to hear with AI detection for birds at windmills. One, what does that even mean? And two, why do the windmill operators care how many birds they're killing if it doesn't impact their livelihood or their profit? And then two, I want to also ask you about recent studies showing that simply painting one turbine black, painting one of the turbines black can reduce bird strikes by up to 70%, allegedly. No new crazy technology, no new AI, just painting one black. It seems pretty riveting to me. But first, what are you guys doing in this world of trying to prevent bird deaths at windmills, and why would a windmill operator care?
Yeah, so I commented on this earlier about how it's important for us to make this net zero transition on the climate side, but without doing too many harms to nature along the way. And that matters for where things are placed, what types of solutions are placed there, the before life and the afterlife of the materials that are used in some of this. But it's also really critical that we make this net zero transition. And what we are not trying to do is say we're putting on our biodiversity hat and that is going to be the only bell that we ring forever, because we're just going to fully oppose those other areas because our dog in this, well, I shouldn't say dog in this fight, probably we can retire that phrase. But that's our flag to wave. Yeah. And so we are only ever going to we're just going to ignore we need to solve the climate crisis, and we need renewable technologies and the really rapid rollout of those to be able to do it. Now, we know that wind turbines can have impacts on birds. It's also important to note that the impacts on birds compared to things like, say, outdoor cats are completely negligible. And it's also important to say that this is a kind of become a boogeyman, to use your phrase, in these political circles. That is a stalking horse for the actual just, full opposition to wind energy and being used as, often as this kind of but look at all of those bird strikes. That all being said, this is still an existential risk to these wind operators. They know that some of these impacts are happening. In some cases, they are being told that the impacts are happening, but they are not actually happening. So being able to actually defensively monitor and show, hey, you all are saying that, there are bird strikes on wind turbines. Well, our company that we invested in here, Spore, which is based in Norway, they worked and did a very long-term study with their camera solution that is an AI tool that tracks birds around wind turbines. And they found tens of thousands of birds going through these turbines and throughout, and they found no impacts. So being able to actually defensively monitor in some of those areas and say, actually, what you all kind of are pointing at from a political point of view and blocking on permitting or blocking on siting, those impacts are not there, and we can start getting those rollouts earlier.
Tom, just to clarify, I want to make sure I'm understanding this correctly. When you say there are tens of thousands of birds that are flying through the windmills and there's no impact, what you're saying is that these birds are going through, not being hit by a windmill, and so they are going through there. And you're saying that this technology can basically help the windmill operator prove that the problem is not as bad as the critics of windmills would say.
That's right. So you can say, because this is an existential risk. There were cases for example, I think in France, there were enough golden eagle strikes from an existing wind farm that had been built that the wind farm was told to cease operations and shut down. That is a huge existential risk for a group like Equinor or Ørsted or someone that is actually putting all of that effort into getting those stood up. So if you can site your wind farm more accurately so that you're actually out of core flyways, or so that you are going to have fewer impacts in one area than another, that's critical. If you can reduce the amount of time that it takes to do the impact assessment and get that into the ground sooner, that's billions of dollars, and also a calculable climate impact to being able to reduce that time. Monitoring during the actual operations of the windmill to maintain compliance with the with whatever jurisdiction you're in, and then as we move into sort of next generation of where the puck is going on this, you can start doing dynamic curtailment by actually, when you see important species that are coming through, and those cameras can detect from just several pixels what type of bird it's assumed to be based on flight pattern and based on recognizable characteristics with their AI model, then you're able to start actually shutting or slowing down those turbines in movement as those continue to sort of fly their way through. So we're actually able to start doing dynamic responses to the biodiversity in the area as those sort of continue to grow and operate. So all of those are the types of impacts that we are like, terrific to be able to help make this net zero transition without so many impacts to nature, and, getting out of being able to provide the data to help us get out of our own way when it comes to this rollout.
To help us get out of our own way and help birds get out of the way of windmills too. So you raised an issue that is of deep importance to me, right? Which is the fact that outdoor cats are massacring hundreds of millions, if not billions, of wild birds, right? It is unbelievable, the numbers, right? Just dwarfing any impact that windmills have. And yet there's virtually nothing that is going on. Even the environmental groups don't seem to be doing anything about this. They don't advocate for policies on it, or even say put a bell on your cat, which might be able to reduce their effectiveness as a predator if they have a bell on their collar. But there is one other area that kills a comparable number of wild birds to outdoor cats that I'm regularly surprised by is not championed more by biodiversity advocates. And that's bird-friendly glass. There are a number of companies out there making bird-friendly glass. We've had one of them on our show here, or link to that in the show notes for this episode at businessforgoodpodcast.com. But why is it that bird-friendly glass, which seems like a technology that those who care about biodiversity and wildlife protection could easily get behind and advocate in building standards to say, any new buildings have to have this type of bird-friendly glass, or maybe just put a part of the LEED certification program. So you say, hey, part of LEED certification should be bird-friendly glass, which it isn't. Why not? Is this an investable area, do you think, in bird-friendly glass companies?
I think that it is. And I'm glad you brought it up, because it's important that we are looking at the data when it comes to what things actually make the most difference to biodiversity loss. And so things like cats, this is a very unpopular topic with cat owners and lovers, of course, and myself included. I am very much a cat lover, and you can also look with clear eyes on the real impacts of cats, particularly in areas there, like New Zealand, like Australia. So it is an extremely important problem. Bird safe glass is another great one. We saw data come out in the last sort of year or two, maybe, that said that it is the cause of 1 to 2 billion bird deaths per year, and that it's almost significantly higher than previously thought, because the data isn't very good. Because we thought these birds some of them may be hitting and flying off, and it turns out they're hitting and critically stunned, maybe fly off for now, but then are eaten by something or fall off and are just unable to continue afterwards. So a lot of that data is actually is done by counting the birds at the base of those infrastructures to be able to estimate on sort of total numbers. And so there are there's a bunch of solutions here that we can be talking about. Okay, one, siting. Siting matters. It matters where you build your building. 2, materials. It matters what you build your building out of, right? There are some things that are just really hard for birds to see. And bird safe glass, this is a great area, an investable area that we would definitely take looks at. There are things that you can do like decals. There are things that you can do like glass treatments that you can work into the glass that would make it visible to the spectrum that birds see and make it easier to avoid. There are things like planning and permitting around where, how are you going to decide where you are going to put your building, and understanding, in that case, migratory pathways, wetlands nearby, understanding whether, this is a seasonal thing or a regular thing. I mean, there's a building in Chicago. I was very fortunate to get to tour the Field Museum in Chicago, and they brought me back into the stacks and, showed some different, very, very, very cool for a science nerd like me with this background. And they showed me a sliding drawer of all of the different bird species that had been collected from the base of this building in Chicago. And it was just myriad and species you would not expect to be seeing in Chicago. And a lot of that, I believe, is due to that placement of that building and where it exists. So using better sort of siting and infrastructure and tools to be able to find where the better positioning is. I even think something like Spore can be a great solution here just on the monitoring and prevention side as well. A very similar tool for Spore can just work right on the building itself and tell you how many bird strikes, what species of birds, give you an accurate readout of what your situation is so that you can make new choices around it.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think that would be great. I would love to be a part of a species that considered where it erected buildings based on how many birds were going to fly into them, right? That doesn't seem like my experience with humans so far, that we would care about that or change what we're doing. But what you mentioned about treatments for glass seems highly possible, right? So there's a company we had on the show called Ornilux, which does what you were saying. They manufacture glass that, regardless of where the building is sited, is visible to birds, but still see through to us. So to the human eye, it looks like normal glass, but to the bird, they actually see the glass. And that, to me, seems like a good solution and something that advocates for biodiversity and for wildlife should be advocating become mandatory for new builds or, again, for LEED certification and more. And, you pointed out that it's 1 to 2 billion birds who are flying into windows. That's just in the U.S. alone. Just in the U.S. alone who are being killed. And that's pretty much the same number who are being killed by outdoor cats. The problem with outdoor cats is it's harder. There's not like a bird-friendly glass equivalent that you could do there, right? You have to reduce the number of outdoor cats, which is going to be vigorously opposed by the people who want those outdoor cats. At the same time, with the glass issue, it seems like there is an investable, as you point out, there is an investable solution right now that companies could be doing. If you could come up with a type of glass that is visible to birds that is cheaper than conventional glass, I mean, you will end up preventing maybe 1 or 2 billion birds from flying into buildings every year. It's amazing.
And the last note I'll make on this as well is that, regulatory landscape does matter and compliance does matter. And to your note on like wanting to be a part of the species that would, make decisions based on this, well, sometimes those decisions need to be shaped by a broader landscape. And that's just part of what needs to happen as well. I think of regulatory as sign of the immune system that can continue to navigate and shape some of the individual decisions that get made. In 2025, the Federal Bird Safe Buildings Act was passed, which mandates bird-friendly design for many of these federal properties. So at least 90% of the glass from the ground up must incorporate bird-safe materials. And if more than 50% of the facade of a building is being replaced, the new glass must comply with bird-safe standards. So obviously, this is just federal buildings, and it's not all buildings. And, and it's going to rely on state and individual building property managers. And I also believe that the better solution to scale is just building a better glass or a treatment that can work with those glass manufacturers that just makes it easier for these, for these decisions to be made, that it's cheaper, it's better, it's more UV effective in the inside of the building, all of those things. And also it reduces bird strikes. That just makes it such a nice to have that the market speaks for it. And we can get that level of scale and speed that will lead to a sub 10-year, highly scaled impact on bird populations worldwide.
Right. I couldn't agree more. A couple quick comments on that. First, the Bird Safe Buildings Act that you referenced is proposed legislation. Just want to be clear, it's not enacted for those of you who are listening here. It's not law. It's a proposed bill. But it's certainly worthy of support. Second, I agree with what you're saying that bird safe glass would be the best answer, right? Like, we're not going to get people to use less glass, right? We're going to get people using bird safe glass. And I think that the advocates for plant-based meat would say the same. We're not going to have people to eat less meat. They just want to make meat that doesn't rely on the really troubling aspect of having to raise all these animals for food. Now, with regard to the type of species we are, it reminds me of a line in the movie and the book Contact by Carl Sagan, where, the aliens we're trying to think about, like, why are the aliens here? And are they going to care about us? Are they here to exterminate us? And, one of the people says, well, when we build a house, like, are we thinking about the ants who we're going to pave over? Like, we don't even think about it, right? We don't desire to, extirpate the ants. It's just, we don't consider it because we want that land for us. Like, they may not be here. The aliens may not be coming to, to execute humanity, but they may not care of whether that's an outcome, right? And my view is the same as so with putting up buildings. Like, I doubt that humans are going to put up a building and say, oh yeah, let's take into consideration, like, the birds were going to fly into it. I wish that was true, but I think you're right that it's most likely just going to be bird safe glass that's going to end up fixing this problem. Now, I want to ask you, so that's one area you said you're open to considering, bird-friendly glass startups that could do what you just said. Are there other types of companies that you wish would exist? You said that you've got, you're looking to make a dozen or so more bets with the remainder of your fund. People listening might want to come pitch you. What are some ideas that you hope that you will be pitched? What are you looking for right now?
I get asked this a lot, and I think that one of the great parts of my job too is that I am surrounded by people that are smarter than me and that are more deeply wedded to the individual problem area, either an industry problem or, a solution type, a scientist that's been working on this for their entire life. And they bring it to me and they say, there's really good research to back all of this up. And now we're ready to roll it out commercially. And I get to say, terrific. That's a really great solution. A great idea for an example of this is funga. So, we have a company, Funga, which is founded by Dr. Colin Averill, who has spent his entire life and career focused on carbon flows in forests, focused specifically on the microbiomes of the soil and those treatments. And you might be familiar with the human gut microbiome transplants, which are aimed to improve the microbiome from, in people for whom that is a problem, which can result in an awful lot of overall body health impacts. You can take that same approach for forests and restore the microbiome of those, degraded lands and working lands with timber on it. And by restoring that soil's microbiome base, the mycorrhizal fungal networks that are meant to be there, you can have a frankly bananas jump in yield. And when somebody brings it to me and says, here's the science, here's the team, ready to go, I get to say, terrific, let's go. And so I'm constantly surprised and I'm constantly brought new stuff in areas that I think we are going to see a lot of new innovation. The pace of AI right now is screaming. And if we are able to basically reduce the speed of prototyping and the speed of getting things in front of customers and seeing if their eyes light up to basically zero, then there are going to be a lot of, that test and iterate loop goes so far down that we'll be able to see, I think, new innovations come out faster and faster with traction from the large industries that, we need to be able to bring them to scale. That is a really exciting opportunity for me. And so I'm thinking about sort of the use of vertical AI within older archaic industries that have impacts on biodiversity and nature, things that are working very closely with supply chains, commodity chains, things like timber and fisheries, which are directly kind of using and pulling from the natural world, being able to sort of force more lower risk and higher repeatability and sustainability out of those commodities feels like an opportunity that I'm going to see more of. And that I'm excited to see more of because I think it's where a lot of opportunity lies.
Okay, cool. Well, for folks who want to pitch you, we will include your contact information via the Superorganism website to get in touch with you on that. Finally, Tom, are the resources that have been helpful? You've led a very interesting life, both as a dive master, not a dive instructor, but at least a lowly dive master, to being a nonprofit warrior at Conservation Next Labs, to now being a venture capitalist. Are the resources that you have found useful that you'd recommend for other people to check out?
I'll give three of different ilks. One that was useful for me earlier in my career as I was sort of learning about the value of nature was a book called What Has Nature Ever Done for Us by Tony Juniper, which was a really great book and a very accessible book to walk you through very concrete examples of cases where the ecosystem services of intact or restored nature has led to strong dollar value benefits by communities and people that have been working around them. So case studies around things like coral reefs, things like mangroves, things like forests, and all of the trillions of dollars of services that they provide, being able to, that was the first time I think that I had really had it put into such concrete terms for me. And it's a great read. The second is a biography, which I have continually come back to through my life and career, is a autobiography, a ghostwritten autobiography of Jacques Cousteau, who is my personal sort of, ocean hero and has been a kind of a figure in my life for a long time. And his biography focusing on things like public risk, on personal risk, woven through with stories about his life. All of those things are, it's a very good and considerate and wonderful read. And so that one I continue to come back to. And my most fun, favorite, and most recent recommendation is a book called Venomous Lumpsucker, which is a sci-fi book that is a satire of biodiversity incentives gone sideways in a near future, which basically is a, buddy comedy romp of a biobanking industry man and a dyed-in-the-wool conservationist as they're thrown together in this mission to go and save the last individual of the venomous lumpsucker fish, each for their own reasons, and continually debate the theory and philosophy of conservation in this new world throughout. And it is just, it drew me right in and was one of the coolest and most fun books. I recommend it all the time. So I'll recommend it again here.
Cool. Well, I'm a sci-fi lover. I read sci-fi quite frequently, and I really appreciate that recommendation. And the others, will include links to all of them in the show notes for this episode at businessforgoodpodcast.com. But for now, Tom, I want to say thanks for everything that you're doing to help preserve biodiversity and help some startups that are trying to do the same and get them off the ground so they can become very successful companies. We'll be rooting for your success.
Thanks a lot for having me on, Paul.
Thanks for listening to the Business for Good podcast. To explore more conversations like this one, visit businessforgoodpodcast.com and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes of founders, investors, thought leaders, and more, turning global problems into powerful opportunities. And if this episode resonated with you, please share it with your network. You never know who you might inspire to be in the business of doing good.